Hi everyone and welcome to Power and Freedom. I'm so glad you could join me. I'm Alana Hunt. Do come on in. If you see me show up in your timeline, do come in, say hi, drop me a comment, drop me a love or a like so I know that you're here. Today's topic is called the pattern repeat. So we've been talking about various things over the last few days. Really this series is about helping you figure out what's happening, how you're creating the results of your life, things to look out for, tools and tips, ways that you can begin to shift your life, things that you can begin to recognize that you're currently doing that are creating the results of your life. And most particularly if some of those results aren't what you want to see, to be able to start shifting those. So one of the things that's come up quite a few times is this idea of repeated patterns. So I thought, let's address this today. The pattern repeat. So I'm going to start off and I'm going to say this. Your brain is a pattern recognition machine. And so in its programming, in its design, it is designed to go out and find patterns, recognize patterns, and it's part of how we're programmed, all these deep patterns that go on. And some of those patterns, it's how we learn to walk. You know, we fall over how many times? We keep falling over, but then we get up and we keep repeating the same actions, the same physical ways of being. You keep doing the same behavior, and sooner or later, hopefully, you learn how to walk. Yeah, you might fall down a whole bunch of times, but sooner or later, your brain starts to get the pattern and you begin to walk. We have, it's how we learn to read. You know, however you were brought up and whatever education system you were in, there's a lot of learning to read. You might have learned with phonetics where you're actually listening for sounds and you're recognizing sounds, or you may have learned how to read just by recognizing words and patterns of words, and you see certain letters together and it makes a specific sound. This is part of how we learn with patterns. It's how we learn new skills. You know, I don't know about you, but every time I learn something new, I have to practice it a few times, yeah? Practice makes perfect. It's an old saying. It's about patterning. It's about doing the same thing over and over again, and it creates a pattern and your brain gets into a groove that allows you to then, you know, keep repeating it with success. It's also how we navigate the world around us. And this is where it is really super important. So, but what's really important is how we navigate the world around us and how patterns and deep patterning impacts how we show up and how that creates the results of our lives. So I'm going to just identify, say, 4 key ways that patterns show up in our lives, or that patterns that we develop. So the first is physical patterns. So that's like the walking, you know, the talking, the routine things. We set up a routine in our lives and we keep doing the same physical movements in the same order day in and day out, and they're patterns of behavior. They work for us. They make us feel comfortable. And that's one of the things about patterns is that, you know, we talk about our comfort zone. You know, and you can kind of talk about that in a way, and to some degree or to a large degree, your comfort zone is sitting in the patterns that feel comfortable. Yeah, does that make sense? So you've got your physical patterns. We've also got thought patterns. Now these are huge. We get into these ways of thinking that play on repeat. And it's part of our thought patterns is, so what happens when we think a thought is a very, very powerful thing. It sends out an energy signal that goes with that thought. And often what happens then is that the thought creates an emotion or triggers an emotion. And so we get into this cycle, and then the emotion often triggers a behavior, and that's how we get our results, right? So thought patterns is a really big one. We also get into emotional patterns, ways of feeling, ways of being in our lives, particular emotions that seem to come up time and time again. Some of those are triggered by situations, and we're going to talk a little bit about that a bit later on. But some of this is just emotional patterns. There's certain things that we feel often, and our chemistry, if you like, sort of often slides into these familiar patterns. Some of those patterns are really helpful, and if you're feeling good and positive emotions, then you've got into some really great habits. But it seems to be human nature that so often, and particularly I think in the world that we're in, where we're bombarded with so much negativity and so much news and all of that, that often what happens is that we get into emotional patterns that are not positive and don't give us the results that we want. And the other sort of patterns that I'm going to talk about today are interrelational patterns. So those are ways of being in relationship to other people or to situations around us. So how are we feeling about patterns? It's kind of a big topic, yeah? So I'm going to get through it in the best way that I can. So what I wanted, there's a plane passing by, I don't know if you can hear that, but that's loud where I am. So these patterns are learned and repeated until we reprogram with new patterns. So what we can't do is just say, well, I'm not going to do that anymore, and just kind of cut across the pattern and say, I'm going to change, or I'm not going to do this behavior anymore, because then it leaves a vacuum, and your brain can't exist in a vacuum. It has to have something, some framework to work with. So when we just say, well, I'm just not going to do that anymore, sometimes we wonder why, no matter how many times we try not to do it, we really struggle, right? We keep doing the same things. We tell ourselves every day, I'm not going to do this today. And yet the same patterns and the same results keep showing up over and over again. So what we have to do is we have to replace the patterns that aren't working for us with patterns that are going to work for us. So it's taken how many years to create the pattern? Repeating over and over again. Your brain's recognized a pattern. It keeps delivering the same thing to you. It reminds you to do this, and it's like it goes on automatic pilot. It's happening in the background, so you're not always even aware. And this is where it's so important to raise our awareness, because often what we're doing is we're just going through the motions of life, and we have no real awareness of what patterns we're repeating that are creating results that, you know, actually we might not want to see. And sometimes what we can do is we can follow the patterns that are working and help us see how we're creating the results, although how those patterns are creating the results, and then we can begin to change them. So you've got to remember, it's taken time to create the patterns that you have, and it takes time to replace it. But you are literally reprogramming your brain when you replace one pattern with another. Now, there's an old saying that says, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. You might have heard that expression, but you know, sometimes we have to break patterns in order to fix our lives, or in order to improve our lives. You know, we kind of go, well, you know, it's okay, let's just keep doing this. But sometimes we have to actively take the time, heart and throat. Sometimes it's difficult, but sometimes we actually have to go out and break some of those patterns that aren't working for us. But what we have to do first is recognize that they're there. And that's often the hard part, yeah, because it's on automatic pilot. I mean, the very term automatic means that you're not usually involved in the decision, or you're not necessarily aware of the pattern. It's just kind of going in the background. It's a little bit like a program in your computer that's playing in the background that you don't think about, and you probably don't really need to think about, because most of the time it's just doing its thing and it's fine. But what happens with the patterns of our lives is that they're playing in the background, and they're powerful. So a lot of this is about coming to an awareness, or beginning to understand and recognize the patterns that we are playing on automatic pilot. And a lot of that stuff is deep. It's been learned years and years and years and years ago. You know, in our childhood, it's been learned through our growing up years. And certainly, you know, there is a school of thought that says a lot of what we understand about the world is formed within the first 7 years of our lives. So if you think about it, if you say, well, most of those have happened in the first 7 years of our lives, and unless you kind of deliberately go and change it and reprogram it in some way, it's going to keep showing up. So, you know, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, however many years that, you know, it is since you were 7, or since those patterns were formed, or a lot of the fundamental basic patterns that are replaying in your life were formed. That's a lot of time for those patterns to become well and truly ingrained. And they're not just in your brain. You know, it's very easy to say, well, I just need to reprogram your brain. And absolutely, that is what part of this process is. But also what's in your brain also lives in every cell of your body. So it's all connected. It's not just your brain, it's in your physicality, it's in your body as well. And this is where we just have automatic movements, you know, that we just do. We just reach for that chocolate bar, or we just whatever it is, you know, we do these things on repeat. So what we're going to have a look at now is some of these. I talked about 4 different types of patterns that we get into, and I want to have a look at those 4 patterns one by one, and maybe give you a few questions or a few ideas of what you could do or begin to recognize to see how those patterns are showing up in your life. You know, the first step to ever wanting anything to be different is to understand what you're doing now, to recognize what you're doing now, how what you're doing now is generating results. And it's, you know, I was talking last week about the reflection connection and following a breadcrumb trail. And this is what part of what this is. It's about looking at the patterns that exist in your life and seeing how those patterns of behavior or thoughts or emotions are creating the results of your life. So the first one we're going to have a look at is physical patterns. And so the main question for this one is, how am I using my body to produce patterns? So think about your routine. Think about what you do every single day. Have a go through your day in your mind. You know, what do you do when you get up in the morning? What are the routine things that you do each and every morning? And how do they impact on how you show up in the day? How do they impact on how you feel? Recognize the patterns that you're doing. And some of this is just, you know, that routine stuff that makes us feel really, really comfortable. And some of that sets us up really well for the day. You know, there's something to be said for routine. It gives us a sense of certainty and a sense of security and a sense of comfort. And that's great. But sometimes there's patterns in your day and in your routine that are producing results that are kind of the opposite of what you really want to experience. And on Tuesday, I was talking about the snowball effect and talking about how we make a little choice here. And if we alter something small, how it can have a snowball effect and show up and be this massive thing and get its own momentum and absolutely transform our lives just by one little tiny choice. And I was talking about, for an example of cutting out sugar, the idea of saying, well, I want to cut out sugar, and what the results of that decision might be. And to start with how you have to, you know, choose it over and over and over again. So it's the same with the routines. Sometimes we can look at our routine and we can go, if we come back to that example, I was talking about how maybe you have your dinner, you sit down, you watch a bit of TV and you grab a chocolate bar, and that's part of your routine. You might not even recognize that that's what you're doing. You may not even make the connection between, oh, I decided I wanted to quit sugar and I'm having a chocolate bar, because it's so ingrained, it's so automatic in your behavior, and it's a pattern that you're repeating day in and day out. And so, you know, that's a tiny little example, but there's lots of things in your routine that you can just have a look at and go, so what am I doing in my routine? What am I doing in my physical body? What am I reaching for? What am I, you know, what am I looking at? Where am I going? What are the things that I'm immersing myself in? And, you know, have a look at what are you watching on TV? What's showing up in your Facebook feed? All of these things are, if you like, part of your routine and things that I might class as, you know, physical patterns. And then they create other patterns that go in your thoughts and, you know, into your emotions as well. So routine is really important. And so have a look at what you're doing each day. Have a look at the things that you're doing on repeat. Ask yourself, are they taking you where you want to go? You know, are they delivering the results that you want? Or maybe there's something there that you could change or shift or alter that would give you a better result, that would maybe be more in alignment with where you want to go or what your goals are or how you want to think or feel or relate to others. So that's your physical patterns. The next one is to look at our thought patterns. Now, this is a biggie, as I said. You know, our thoughts, they're so automated. They're so on automatic pilot. It's incredible when you actually begin to recognize what you're thinking. It takes so much awareness because it just goes on and on and on. And apparently we think now, I'm trying to remember, it was something like 70,000 thoughts a day. So that's a lot of thoughts, right? I mean, how are you going to monitor every single thought? I mean, you'd never get anything done, would you? You'd just be in your head going, I'm thinking this, I'm thinking this, I'm thinking that. And so we're not talking about, you know, that kind of level of micromanaging, but what we are thinking about is checking in. What am I thinking about? What's going on in my head? You know, what am I thinking right now? And this comes back to as well to self-talk. So if you know what self-talk is, that's that conversation that goes on in the background all the time. There's the thinking that is running your life and running the systems and making sure you get where you need to be on time and all of those sorts of things. But there's just self-talk, which is like this narrative that's playing on replay over and over and over again in the background of your life. And those thoughts have enormous power. They are literally creating the results of your life, but they're also dictating how you show up in the world and how other people see you. So it comes back to our interrelational patterns, which we'll talk about in a minute. So become aware of what you're thinking, and then off the back of that thought, how does that thought make you feel? Because when you tie a thought and an emotion together, it has so much power. It's like supercharging your thoughts, you know. There's the energy that goes out is a really strong creator in your life. And so those thought patterns, what are you saying to yourself? Are you saying things that are being repeated from things other people have said to you, maybe in childhood? Are you repeating your worst nightmares? You know, we all have things that is kind of like, oh, I really don't want this to happen. And it's very easy to focus on the things we don't want. And so it's, you know, we find ourselves in this thought pattern that's like, I don't want this to happen. Oh God, please don't let this happen. And oh, I'm terrified that this might happen. And so you're reinforcing a thought of what you don't want rather than what you do want. Kim's saying, I call it a checkup from the neck up. Awesome. That's so good. Yeah, absolutely. So start here and go, what am I thinking? That's absolutely brilliant. And so that's what we're doing here. We're checking in to see what we're thinking. What are we telling ourselves? I often use the example of, and we'll sort of slant it a little bit to women at the moment, although I know men do this as well, but it's more common in women. You go out shopping with a girlfriend and you're clothes shopping, and you go into the changing rooms, and you know, you're in one cubicle and she's in another, and you're trying on some outfit. Hey, maybe it's for a special occasion, or maybe you're just having fun, but you try something on, and your friend tries something on, and she says to you, hey, what do you think of this? And of course, what do? You're complimentary, aren't you? You know, you might have an opinion about it, but you're going to be saying, well, you know, I really like that color on you, or I like how that sits, or, you know, I think it's lovely, but what if it was in a different color? You know, you're going to be doing something that's complimentary when you're responding to her. My question is, how do you speak to yourself when you try on that outfit and see yourself in the mirror? Are you as complimentary? Because you know what we do? We go, oh gosh, my butt looks big in this, or oh, I don't like that color on me, or oh, you know, I can see this little wrinkle here, or, you know, we are so unkind to ourselves. And, you know, maybe that's not what you're thinking about every single minute, but the fact that if you show up in that changing room and you're criticizing yourself and you're noticing all the things that are not so perfect, or in your mind you think are not so perfect, then what you're doing is you're repeating something, and the chances are that those thoughts, those words don't even belong to you. This is part of, I'm trying to think what I was talking about. There was one of the topics I was talking about anyway, about how we create definitions around certain things. So we might say what it is to look pretty, or what it is to look beautiful, or what it is to look slim. We've created pictures and connections and definitions around that. And so when we look ourselves in the mirror and we go, I don't measure up to this expectation that I've created about what I should look like, then what do? We criticize ourselves. We don't do the same thing for other people. So how about we bring some of that lovely thought process that is complimentary and kind and supportive and, you know, builds confidence that we do for our friends. Let's start doing some of that ourselves. We are our own worst critic, Angie. It's terrible. And just remember, a lot of that stuff isn't actually, it's not your truth. It is something you've either adopted or some expectation that you've created around what it is that you think you should look like. One of the most harming, damaging words is should, because it sets up expectations and it makes us feel less. It makes us feel inadequate. It makes us feel like we're not enough. And, you are enough. You're more than enough. You're fabulous just as you are. And we need to begin to start to, that's the same thing, said two ways, but, to start building into our lives instead of destroying. And so have a look at those thought patterns. What are you telling yourself? What are you thinking about? What are you thinking about on repeat? What are the patterns of thought that are, and how are those affecting your lives? And how is that impacting the results that are showing up? And the other way to look at your thoughts, because so often what we're thinking also comes out our mouth in a conversation. Not all of it, we're very good at sort of saying, oh, we're not going to say that. But there is a lot that in conversation with people we say, and they're based on some of the things that we think or that we believe or understand about the world. So follow what you're saying. Start to check in and listen to what you're saying to other people. I was listening to someone yesterday and there were a few things that were said and I thought, wow, I can see how you're putting some blocks in your life. You know this is going to happen. And in that knowledge of what you know is going to happen, there's a thought in your head and now you're saying it out loud. And so you're making it real. This is true. You are reinforcing the pattern of thinking and you're going to get a result out of that. What it is that you think you can't do or that you think is going to show up that isn't what you want, it's going to show up because there's so much power behind the thoughts and the words that you say. Angie, would you say this to a child? If not, then why are you saying it to yourself? Absolutely. I mean, that's it. To the most vulnerable, sweetest person that you wouldn't hurt in the world, if you're not going to say it to yourself or to a child, why would you say it to yourself? That's a fantastic point, Angie, and I think that's a really good way of checking in with yourself and saying, would I say this to a child? But also have a think about what you're saying out loud in your conversations, just in your everyday life, because what we say lets us know what we're thinking. And we can begin to go, oh, wow, I didn't really realize I was thinking that. I want to change that. That's not what I want to experience. I need to shift that. I need to not say that now. So what can I say instead? Remember, we've got to replace it with something else, not just go, oh, I'm not going to say that again, but replace it with something else. So if you're saying to yourself, let me think if I can come up with something on the fly here. If you're saying to yourself, I'm not slim enough, for example. I mean, it doesn't matter how slim you are, it's not important, but let's just use it because it's a common thing that people often struggle with. I'm not slim enough. Start saying something like, I absolutely love how I look. I'm really comfortable in my skin. And to start off with, it's going to feel like a lie, right? But have a look, go back, and then have a look at what it is that you've defined slim as. Or actually ask yourself, is slim something that you need to have in your life? Because, we're all born with a different body, right? Stevens is saying it's absolutely mind-blowing how abusive we are to ourselves without even knowing it. Oh, unbelievable. And even when you become aware of this stuff, we still do it. It's so deeply ingrained. But this is where I wanted to talk about, I'm just trying to remember the topic that I called it. It's fallen out of my head. Maybe it'll come back. But it's 2 or 3 videos ago anyway. And it's about looking at how we're defining the words that we use. Words have so much power. And, slim, it's not important. It's about how you feel in your skin, how you feel inside, and how you feel inside shows up on the outside. So if you feel beautiful, you are beautiful. If you feel ugly, not that you're going to look ugly, but people are not going to see your beauty. you know? So it's all about how you're defining things. And as you say, Stephen, we are so abusive, and a lot of that abuse is self-abuse because we've defined things and we've set expectations for ourselves that we decide we're not meeting. Don't keep beating yourself up for not meeting some expectation that you've created that actually isn't you, that comes from external, from the past, from childhood, from media, from somewhere else that actually has nothing to do with you. Begin to see how you're defining things. Begin to see the expectations and the rules that you've created around these words, and begin to shift them. I talked about narrowing the gap, you know, the gap between where you are and where you think you should be. If it's big, you're never going to feel enough. You're never going to feel like you measure up. You're going to feel inadequate. You're going to feel less than who you truly are. So start narrowing the gap. Start bringing your definitions closer to who you are at your core, to get them to match and be in alignment with who you are. But one of the things when we're looking at patterns, and this is why I wanted to talk about this topic today, is that these patterns are so deeply ingrained. And I wanted to give you some ideas about how you can start to recognize the patterns. And then if you use the other tools that I'm giving you, you know, the reflection connection, the snowball effect, and if somebody can remember what this other one was I talked about the other day and let me know, that would be brilliant, because it's completely fallen out of my head. I haven't got my notes with me with all my recent topics, but it's about having a look at, so if you recognize a pattern and a thought, what is it that you thought needed to show up? You're thinking something, the thought is creating, probably has a set of expectations and rules with it, yeah? So what is that? How can I shift it? How can I think differently? How can I choose a different thought? How can I create a new pattern? So that's your kind of thought patterns. But one of the things you can really start to pay attention to is the things that you say and how you are speaking out there in the world, because it really is like a little bit of a signpost to what you're thinking. The other one is emotional patterns. So it's how you're feeling. What is your most common emotion? How do you feel most of the time? Do you feel peaceful? Do you feel happy? Do you feel anxious? Do you feel uncertain? Do you feel worried? You know, what are the emotions that are going on inside of you most of the time? Because those emotions are telling you a lot, because actually often as well, the thoughts and emotions are tied together. So when you begin to see your emotions, you can begin to see what you're thinking, and you can change, you know, you can work backwards. What emotions do you feel regularly? And what happens? What are the events? What are the situations? What are the thoughts that create that emotion or trigger that emotion? So I was talking the other day about what would need to happen for you to feel happy, to feel successful, to feel, you know, loved, whatever it is that you want to feel. But it works the other way. What would need to happen for you to feel anxious? What would need to happen for you to feel uncertain, to feel unsuccessful, to feel trapped, to feel stuck, to feel, you know, whatever it is? What is actually happening that's generating that emotion or creating that emotion? So when we begin to recognize patterns, we can begin to see what sits underneath the pattern. Why have we got into that pattern? Because your brain is just delivering what you've told it to deliver. That's how it works. It's programmed. There's all these patterns. As I said at the beginning, your brain is a pattern recognition machine. It's how we learn. But when we want to learn something different, or we want to experience something different, we have to work backwards to discover those subtle ingrained patterns that are running our lives, because that's fundamentally what's happening. We're on automatic pilot. A lot of that stuff that's on autopilot is creating the results of our life. So as we begin to see what those things are, we can begin to shift them and alter them and change them, if you like, so that then the results change. What we see outside of ourselves, what we see reflected back at us, is also different. So ask yourself, you know, what are the emotions you feel quite often, and what is happening to create those emotions or triggering those emotions? And you can kind of take that backwards, and you can say, okay, so when this happens, it creates this feeling. There's a pattern, there's a connection between those two things, and you can begin to break those patterns, you know. So Yes, reprogramming, Kim. That's absolutely what it is. And sometimes we think, we don't even recognize that this is where we have so much power in our lives. And I talk about power and freedom all the time. We have the power to completely reprogram our brains, and not just in the way that we think and feel and behave, but also for health. We can reprogram ourselves at a cellular level by shifting what's happening in our brain. It doesn't just show up in the external results of our life. It shows up in our health and our well-being in our bodies, and how we feel, whether we are ill, whether we are well, our fitness levels, all of those things that we're looking to reprogram have far-reaching, hugely far-reaching impacts that we sometimes can't even imagine when we're at this point where we're going, okay, so what's actually going on here? And I want to shift something. I want to make something different out here. But you get all these extra results, all these extra benefits that you're not always aware of and don't anticipate, because it is so powerful and so transformational that, when I was talking about the snowball effect on Tuesday, one little thing here compounds and gains its own momentum until it becomes this massive transformational experience from one tiny choice, but one tiny choice that you repeat day in and day out until it becomes a new pattern, a new thing on automatic pilot that just takes you in a different direction. And it's quite amazing. I was actually reading something. I'm just going to go on to one more thing and then we'll close. But I was reading something yesterday, and it was talking about maths. And somebody was doing an equation, if you like, and it was, let's say it was 472 times whatever. And then they did another equation that was 472.64, and they ran the same equation through a computer, and the results, it was a weather predictor. That's what it was I was reading about. And so what you actually had was the one without the decimal points produced a certain outcome that would suggest the weather was going to be like this, but by adding the 2 decimal points, the entire forecast was so different that it wasn't recognizable as the same thing. And so what you have is this tiny shift, 2 little decimal places. The main number's the same, but the 2 little decimal places completely threw out the results that were achieved on the first, the main number. So it's those little things that compound, that gain their own momentum, that take us somewhere just like completely different. So this is where we can use the snowball effect that I was talking about on Tuesday. If we recognize some of these patterns that are happening in our lives, and we just make a little shift, and we keep making that little shift until it becomes a pattern, until it becomes a habit, choose it every day, then it becomes automatic. And you have no idea, you can't see or foretell today what the results are going to be. But I can tell you, if you do it, they're going to compound, and they're going to be huge. And it's going to be massive advantages and massive benefits that you can't possibly think about today. So, we can use this snowball effect, tiny little tweaks, create massive momentum and take us somewhere really, really different. So the last pattern I wanted to talk about is interrelational patterns. So now these are usually formed in childhood, or a lot of the foundation of interrelational patterns. So this is how we relate to others and situations, but a lot of the time how we relate to other people in our lives. So, whatever situation you were raised in, there's relationships with others in childhood, because people take care of us, because we would die if we were left to our own devices, right? So there's always people in our lives. So there's relationships that are formed in childhood. And so what happens is that your brain learns ways of being. Somebody will behave a certain way, it will create a response, your brain connects the dots, if you like, and it becomes a pattern. So somebody says something, or their energy is a certain way, or they have a certain expression on their face, and it triggers a response. And so these are interrelational patterns, and they show up in all our relationships. And of course, the place they show up most is in our relationship with our nearest and dearest. So what we want to be having a look at here, and this is really, really important, because the relationships that we have in our lives, I think it's one of the most challenging parts of our lives, managing ourselves, if you like, in relation to other people. there's a lot of automatic behaviors that are triggered when we're in relationships, and it's deep stuff that we're often really unaware of and have no idea where it's come from, but we just keep showing up in the same way, or we keep finding that somebody's responding to us in this particular way. And I have a blog on my site called The Power of the Pause, and I actually did a talk about this, but it's about taking the moment to count to 10, or to stop for a second before you respond, because what we do is we have these very deeply ingrained patterns, ways of being in relationship to other people that, wow, does it impact our lives massively, massively. So relationships can be a place that's really triggering, and it's somewhere that you can really begin to see the patterns that are deeply ingrained and begin to maybe shift them. So what we want to have a look at here is, how do you respond to the people closest to you? For example, do you find yourself responding with irritation? Do you find yourself responding with tears to certain situations? Do you shut down and pull away in situations that, or in relationship to certain experiences, or the way somebody shows up in them and their selves? How are you responding to that? Do you feel defensive with people? How do you handle criticism? And of course, you know, criticism is something that's very often very, very difficult. And sometimes we perceive that somebody's criticizing us when actually they're not. But because of programming and because our brain makes those connections, we immediately get into a place where we feel triggered. We feel like we're being criticized, and there's an automatic response to that. So what we're looking at here is how we are showing up with other people. So how do you handle criticism? Ask yourself, is somebody criticizing me here, or are they just making a statement? We use words in different ways. People phrase sentences in different ways and in different cultures. And coming from New Zealand, we can be quite abrupt, blunt, direct. We like to say we're direct, but it doesn't always come across that way. Sometimes people can see it as being really blunt, and you go somewhere else and there's no intention to be at all cruel or unkind or in any way, but you know, we perceive things differently based on what our understanding is and what we're used to in the world. So sometimes we have to take a step away, use the power of the pause, if you like, and ask ourselves actually what's going on. Are we being criticized here? Is somebody being unkind? Are they trying to help us? What is their motivation? What is the intention behind it? But having a look at how we show up in relationship to other people, whether that's your nearest and dearest, whether it's people down the, you know, if you're part of a club or a, you know, an organization, whether it's at work, how you are responding to situations. And I know I've had lots of times where I've immediately gone from reading something or hearing something to way off on a tangent that actually has nothing to do with what was intended. And so what's happening there is something's being triggered. Some automatic pathway has been triggered in my brain, and not just in my brain, as I said, in my cells, so that all the force of all my emotion and all that energy is behind that, that trigger. And actually you can't control how you show up. So, you know, it's having a look at those things. These are, so there's 4 patterns there that I've talked about today. So the physical patterns, your thought patterns, your emotional patterns, and your interrelational patterns. And if you begin to look at what's happening in all of these patterns, start to become aware of, you know, in your physical patterns, have a look at your routine. In your thought patterns, have a good look at your self-talk. In your emotional patterns, have a look at how you're feeling most often and what might be happening to create that emotion. And then in your interrelational patterns, you're looking at how you're responding to the people around you, how you are showing up in relation to them and how they show up. So that's the pattern repeat. I hope that's been really helpful. I want to thank everybody for being here today. Have a fantastic weekend, as I say. Go do something fun. Go and break a pattern, maybe. Go and do something really awesome today over the weekend. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Take care till then.